Welcome to Unscripted with Jeff Pedowitz. I sit down with remarkable people from very different worlds, security and science, business and medicine, technology and the arts, for honest conversations about AI and where it's taking us. No scripts, no talking points, just what they actually think. I'm Jeff Pedowitz. Let's get into it.
My guest today started with a very small, very unglamorous problem. A broken sewer decision in a small Cape Cod town, made without data, that changed the place his family had lived in for generations. Russ Wilcox built a company, ArtifexAI, to fix that everywhere, using AI to dig the buried public data out of zoning codes and meeting minutes and hand it back to communities. And somehow, the same person is also a leading analyst of the US-China AI race, advising the Pentagon and the State Department. So he sees AI at both ends, the hyperlocal town meeting and the global contest between superpowers. That range is exactly why I wanted him. Russ, welcome to Unscripted. Let's get into it.
Awesome, Jeff. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So tell me a little bit then how you grew up. Like, how did you kind of come to be all this?
It's funny. So I come from a military family. Both my parents served in the Army. My dad served in the 82nd Airborne. My mom served in finance, and I am an Army brat. Grew up on a variety of military bases and really saw the importance of service to one's country and one's community. And throughout my life, that's one kind of foundational kind of brick that has been laid in my soul, is that humanity is based on communities and how those communities help someone rise up against adversity. And so I noticed that my life was different when I was 16, when most 16-year-olds were working at their local grocery store or ice cream parlor. I was a full-time federal employee with the U.S. Geological Survey doing computational physics, looking at something called methane gas.
So you were a slacker then, doing physics, computational physics at 16.
Yes, and I was published several times before 18 and 22. And that's when I realized that the world could be used differently, that you could use computation as a way of not fully understanding phenomenon, but giving you a viewpoint into the world that other people hadn't seen. And so that was formative. And so ended up going to Boston University for my undergrad in computational physics. And a year off actually to be a professional jazz musician. And after that, I went to do my grad work at the University of Michigan, where I was there for about a year and a half before I did one of the kind of the biggest risks of my life, which was drop out of a fully funded fellowship as a first generation college student, based off of a Reddit post to consult in this booming field called data science and machine learning, and built a career around using alternative forms of data for insight, and was lucky enough to actually be one of the pioneers of large language model technology. Ended up working my way up to a company in Oslo, Norway, where I was building, at the time, large language models, or now called small language models, from scratch, pioneering using YouTube transcripts for alternative sets of training data for better context. And that kind of was like the formative understanding of machine learning for me, was that we operate in a world where structured data is key, but it only represents probably about 15% or less of human knowledge. The rest is in the written works, the multimodal data sets, the meeting minutes, the YouTube videos. Probably something like this will be on YouTube at some point, where someone will mine my transcript, right? And saying there's an aspect of community and humanity there that is unlocked. And little did I know that would lead to some of the bridges between a septic system problem on a Cape Cod town to understanding the US-China AI race. Why? Because it all relies on understanding the context of human development at the community. And so that's kind of the interesting phase around me, where I'm a self-taught programmer, never once took a computer science class. I am a statistical physicist and computational physicist that fell in love with the policy space, understanding the nuances of philosophy and history and how this comes together. And really one of the strong proponents of this idea of AI should empower humanity. We are at a pivotal moment in human history, and we want to make sure that no human is left behind in it, right? And so that kind of drives me. That's where I got my start, and all started at the USGS when I was 16, when I showed up, and my boss had a book on Fortran 77 and said to me, if you want to be useful, read this.
There's a lot to dive in there. So let's scroll back though. So you were an Army brat, moving around. First, what did that do for you? Was that hard, like constantly changing and uprooting, like from establishing friendships and just... Yeah,
it really shows you what community really means and how community can be transplanted, where you start to find the underlying threads of what bring people together and what it means to find common ground. So I'd say that that's one of the first things that it taught me, was that even if you are moving into a new community or a new part of the world, right, you can find people that you can relate to by common ground. And that's what it taught me, common ground in the viewpoint of service. And I would say that's the biggest lesson that I got taught. And both my parents actually didn't want me to serve in the military. They said that there was a different path for me, but that's how I shaped myself in the viewpoint of my company and the work that I do, is through service through others for our country as well. So I might not be enlisted or working directly with government agencies at this point, but that always comes back to say, how can we bring forth the best aspects of American society through community, through service, recognizing the good in others.
So now at 16, I was working in a restaurant myself, a lifeguard, just, how did you develop your expertise in math and physics at such an early age? Is this something that you were inspired by a class or instructor, or were you always good at it?
No, I actually wanted to be a historian. That's what I wanted to be. I always found myself being a stronger writer than at math and science. I was always interested in science and explaining the world. I remember having like a little solar powered cooking oven we had to do in 6th grade that my mom helped me with, and I was fascinated about how you can use the sun rays to do something like that. But I didn't think that was my path. And long story short, basically, at the time, the U.S. government was doing a lot to promote science at the younger age, and they had this program called STEP and SCEP, which was early education that would eventually be a funnel to federal employment through this program that eventually got defunded. But the supervisor at my time, Dr. William J. Winters, reached out to all of the local science department chairs and said, hey, do you have someone who might be a good fit for this? And I was close with my biology teacher, Mr. Anastasia, and he's the one who referred to me. And so I went in, 16 or actually 15 years old with a Walmart shirt and a Walmart tie, and sat down and was talking about, my love of Star Trek. For the most part, Star Trek got me interested in the sciences and things like that. And that was the connection point where I was the one who was selected to work 40 hours a week during the summer, 20 hours a week during the school year. That continued all throughout my undergraduate career. And that just reinforced the viewpoint of science as a collaborative endeavor. We were collaborating with folks from India, from China. That also has a very interesting tie in the future of my work with the China race. But you start to realize that science is more than just discovering the unknown, right? It's unlocking collaborative endeavors through humanity to push yourself to better understand the world. And I'd say that's kind of where my viewpoint of science really changed, right? No longer just trying to do a perspective of quantifying something, but rather discovering and furthering the human endeavor.
So how did you get attached to that initial sewer project in Cape Cod?
Yes. So I was very interested for a long time in alternative sets of data. For example, Some of the financial modeling projects I would do in the mid-2010s would be scraping out of stock listings from Walmart and other places to better understand financial forecasts for financial models, right? So I knew that there was a lens of uncertain data out there that could be unlocked. And this thing happened in 2020 called COVID. I don't know if you heard about it, but it happened.
I vaguely recall, yeah.
And I actually got the last flight from San Francisco back to Boston. I was doing a nomad life at the time, and I got the last flight from Boston or San Francisco to Boston. And I call my mom and I say, "Hey, Mom, do you want to roommate for 6 months?" Well, that 6 months ended up being like a year and a half. And I actually went to swim in the same pond and the same beaches that I did as a kid. And it had only been 15 years or maybe a little bit lower than that. And I couldn't because the algal blooms got so bad. And so I'd talk to people and I'd ask them, "Hey, why is this happening? How did this happen so quickly?" And they'd use this term zoning as a insight into why it was happening. I said, "I don't know anything about a zoning board. I'm going to go participate in local government." And so I step into my first zoning board of appeals meeting, and I step back to 1700. It was beautiful. Like, you see what democracy is actually supposed to do, but a democracy with 3 chairs of people sitting in it and a bunch of old white men talking about things that they don't have any understanding on. And so here we are, this town was debating a sewer project. Now, phase 1, I might not get these numbers 100% correct, so just use them as order of magnitude. Phase 1 for this town was $250 million to sewer a part of the town.
Okay.
A lot of money, especially for a town that brings in an annual revenue of about $65 million, with the vast majority going to the school system. And so they're talking about this sewer plan. And I raised my hand, being the scientist in the audience, and during public comment, I said, "Why are you sewering this part of town? Where is the data that says you should do this?" And they said, "Well, a consultant told us." Said, "Great. Where did the consultant get that data?" And they said, "Well, I don't know. The consultant did their processes, and this is the plan that he laid out." I said, "Well, you're representatives of our community. Did you actually go through and read all of the permits and identify where the efficacy would be for this plan?" I said, "No, we can't do that. That would take too much time. They're all in paper record and whatever." I said, "That's not a good answer." So I go home, I call my college roommate, Birdie, and I say, "Hey, Birdie, do you want to replace local government with AI?" Joking, of course. I do not believe that AI should be replacing local government, but rather embedded in it for better decision-making. But he says, "That sounds very interesting. What are you saying?" And so what I did was,
because this is before commercial LLMs came out.
Yes.
Right? So
this was 22. So ChatGPT, I think, had just launched, right? And so I said, well, let's take this YouTube model that I made where we fine-tune BERT at the time, or I think even T5 we were using, and use it to go through and extract out from these old PDFs and these old meeting minutes and these old YouTube videos and map out where there are variances. Where should you sewer? And what we did was we put it on a map, and we'd map this out and we'd say, "Hey, this is where you should pay attention." Well, then I show that to the town and they say, "Well, that's nice. We're still going to listen to the consultant." But that's when I realized that there was going to be a different way of looking at the world, and there'd be so much valuable data locked in these records, because humans like to write, they don't like to read. And then when you piece them together, you get some very interesting stories. And
particularly with government, though, right? And even education, you got a lot of systems that are paper-based still, that are not computerized. So from a digital standpoint, it does make it harder to get access to it.
100%. And this is where I differ from a lot of my colleagues in the AI space right now, where I don't like the idea of a chatbot. I think it's a cop-out. I think that the idea of creating a frontier model or a god model like Mythos or Fable is a disservice to humanity, because what happens is that if you go back to the underpinnings of these models, they're task-based. And so what
hang on, I have Dario on the other line. I think you want to say that again?
I will gladly debate on that. And you actually see this a lot in the work that the Chinese are doing that we can get into a little bit later in terms of what they call swarm models and specialized agents, right? But what happens is you'll have hallucinations with these large language models. So you might have another company that might do something similar to Artifex and say, hey, we're summarizing your town meeting minutes, right? But you'll get a hallucination because they don't understand temporal characteristics. They don't understand the context where they're fully operating in. But when you use AI with a specific task to create new structured data and then build models on top of that, then can be fed into a large language model, that's the differentiator. And once you get that beautiful, novel, curated data model of a structured data set that then you can connect to other things, you get to find some very, very interesting perspectives on the world. And that's where we kind of grew from. So we grew from this idea of a civic infrastructure space to saying, hey, we can be the central operating system for governments across the world, being able to unify these siloed sets of data. And then you realize you're sitting on these data sets and you can do predictive modeling, you can do predictive risk modeling. You want to build a $500 million energy facility, but you're concerned that it won't get through your local board. We have the historical context to identify that those risks, that Councilman Jones really cares about fire suppression. Put that in your notice of intent and you'll get your project through. That'll be your winning vote. The same thing that we can do work with governments and then private companies. And then we start to scale and say, what happens when you put this to other countries? And you start to see the connections that China does at the local level and be able to recognize that those are threads that you can pull, breadcrumbs that you can leave, and once you put together, you can actually do something like predict what was going to be in their 15th five-year plan, which led me into The Diplomat, right? All of that was reconstructed based on boring public record that no one cares about.
Well, I mean, people do care about community growth. I mean, you think about, so the towns, they have engineers, they plan where they're building a school, where they're building new roads, and inevitably, they try and predict population trends and things. And then so a new school opens, and on day one, they already have trailers because they're over capacity, because by the time it got through, government bureaucracy, procurement and building, and now the population growth has exceeded what the school was built for. So perennially, these towns, I think they're hitting off their back foot. They build a road so that they can handle more traffic, but then the more traffic comes in, so the new road becomes just as busy as the old road, just with more cars on it. So how will using AI in this way change the arc of planning?
All you have to do is look at China. And that's where I realized that the US was losing the AI race. And I've been a strong proponent of that argument, not because I don't love my country. In fact, I love my country so much that I call it out when it needs to be called out, right? And you see that kind of now also with the whole Kinney arguments that we can get into if we have time later. But you take a look at the two different races going on. You talk about planning and urban development. That hasn't been strongly invested in the United States because they're long-scale projects. There's a long-term behavior, and a lot of the way the market operates in a way is like day traders right now, looking to have subscription models and have quick profits. And I'm not denigrating the VCs out there. I think that's a thesis that has worked and will continue to work. So you take a look at a step back and say, there's two different viewpoints of artificial intelligence. There's one with this God model that you can ask anything. You might be not fully certain of its answers, right? It might lie to you, inherent risk, but you can ask it everything and have some sort of answer. The other side is what China is doing, and you asked a very poignant question on planning. And that's where they started. So China took the other side of the coin, which was to treat AI as infrastructure. So they have what are called data reservoirs, and they're doing this. They are mining data across their provinces and even now across Belt and Road Initiative countries. And they are organizing that and putting it in what's called the data reservoir for modeling. And then they extend that out, and they have 2 loops that they work on. They work on one, the large frontier models like Kimi or Quen or DeepSeek, but they have smaller, fine-tuned swarm agents that can be quickly trained on this data, right? So the important thing to recognize is that China sees the aggregation of data and unification in a way of a system that goes into urban planning. They are able to build very quickly, one, because of their political structure, but 2, they are sitting on this data that can make those decisions informed. And then they extend that out to their global initiatives. So if you take a look at some of the, I have a map that I showed State Department and the British House of Commons that showed kind of research initiatives for AI in developing countries. And I think that's very important. We should support the humanitarian effort. And when you put it on the map, you see that those initiatives are along 70% of the world's trading routes, and China gets that data. And that's going to be going into their models, right? So they understand the world as a system for planning, right? On the Western side, the reason why we look at these God models is because we're so siloed. We don't have the ability to unify all of our knowledge because we're built on 400, 500 years of public records law. China has a very thin veil of decision making because they're basing it on last.
But how does that translate into us losing the race? That's just a different style of planning, right? I mean, here we're entrepreneurial, we're capitalistic, we are decentralized. There's a lot of autonomy with states, local governments, businesses, entrepreneurs. What is it about China's approach to master planning from an AI standpoint that you would say is leading them to lead the race?
Because they're viewing this as a collective endeavor, right? So if you take a look at the development of societies and the development of innovation, the West has typically won on the argument of innovation, right? Even going back to kind of feudal Europe, where you had very strong technological advances, you had the competition between nation states that allowed for gunpowder, these types of technological innovations. And that's where it got us to today, right? And in the West now, in my opinion, that competition has turned into a funnel where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy for, in a way, feudalism. You have the Dario Amadeus, you have the Elon Musks, right? You have this top layer that are now servicing governments. And you are looking at Dario and Sam for those answers, as opposed to saying, what is the good of humanity? And even Sam Altman talks about this. There was a podcast around his meteorization of human knowledge, right? And so you say, okay, you have an individual set of guys like us, saying, how can I use this to be more efficient? And this goes into the whole argument that the AI race is an extension of the Industrial Revolution, which I fundamentally disagree with. So you take a look at that and you say, okay, you start asking questions. You start asking questions to these God models. Those God models are only trained on 15% of human knowledge, 92% of it's English, and they don't have the context in which they operate on. Right? But there isn't a need to compete anymore because that competition has created abundance of opportunity, right? And I'm not saying that we don't have the ability to win this race. I think we need to reframe that. But when you're operating only on 15% of human knowledge, and you say that we're running into issues around the grid where we're maxed out, where we're having massive issues around data centers, you're having massive internal political fragmentation, right? It's being, what's the best way to say this? It is being exacerbated by having essentially a feudalistic structure with these large language models companies. Whereas China, they had taken the slow route. Collectivism, right? And this is where you get into very interesting developments of human storytelling of how governments form, right? China is a collective society. They are not just communists, right? They are communist with Chinese characteristics if you read Mao's writings. And so what happens is that they don't have that competitive nature that would allow for rapid technological innovation. But we've gotten to the point now where the knowledge hubs have become so centralized that they can operationalize these systems for the quote unquote betterment of their society. And I'm not saying that I agree with what defines their betterment, but they can operate and see the systems where they say, okay, here's what we're going to do in the next 5-year plan. And here's the next set of policies, the master planning laws, that are going to make that happen. So they view the world as the system, and they view the world as infrastructure. On the West side, right, we have gotten to this level of hubris, in my opinion, of our technological innovation, where when we start talking about AGI, which I should say is not mentioned in the Chinese lexicon, then we start slapping export controls. We take a precarious geopolitical system that is rapidly changing and saying that, oh, it's too dangerous, so we have to put export controls on mythos and fable. And that was one of the last bastions of innovation that Europe would listen to us and hold out on. And we've cut that out. Now they're looking at AI sovereign models. They are looking at potentially China. And then you look at the Chinese side and you say, well, these technologies, we don't know what's going to happen. It's going to grow. But China is now looking at the infrastructure play. What happens when you put this in the infrastructure layer, the chip layer, the quasi-software hardware layer, where now they are also aggregating data and building profiles and building unknown unknowns into a system that you have no control over? That is why I make the argument that right now the US is losing the global AI race, not because we're not producing the best technologies, though China has now released Kimi, which is introducing a hole into that argument, but rather we're not looking at this as the system, right? A system layer of technology.
How are you, when you look at the race, how are you defining what winning and losing is? Is it based upon community enablement? Is it based upon economic growth? Is it based upon raising the level of humanity because of AI? Like what dimensions are you looking at?
Last one, raising the level of humanity with AI, because we are in a unique point in our societal development where if we in the West view this as the next lens or the next iteration of the Industrial Revolution, we've lost, because the efficiency argument is gone. Because what it's doing is destabilizing systems of trust, it's destabilizing institutions, it's rapidly reshaping how society should interact. China, on the other hand, recognized that. All you have to do is look at AI education standards. In the US, we have barely any. And oftentimes it's split between being kind of the Luddites and the true technologists, right? If you look at some of the most innovative education policies coming out of technology, you should look at China. They've had these since 2020. So they take a look at this idea of embodied intelligence. They don't call it artificial intelligence. They only use AI in terms that are outward politically focusing. Internally, they just call it intelligence or embodied intelligence. And so what they take a look at is a concept that I've been writing on called cognitive sovereignty, where in China, the technology is supposed to further their viewpoint of human development, whether we agree with that or not, right? But there are bounds on this. There are bounds on, you can't talk about Tiananmen Square, you can't talk about certain things, and China puts you in a cage, right? But as a human, you're able to retain that cognitive armor. Yes, I know I can't talk about Square. Technology will help me understand this, that, or the other thing. On the other side, America puts you in the same cage and throws a flag on it and calls it freedom. Just look at the safeguards around fable. Let's look at the safeguards around mythos, right? Where you don't even know that these systems are profiling. I cannot ask Claude anymore about a meal plan because it will infer that I have an eating disorder. Why? Because the safety classifiers on top of these large language models are not contextual. I don't have an eating disorder. I'm just tracking my calories very detailed in my macros, and you're training for a marathon, right? So that's where the split's happening, where you start to see what is the role of humanity in technology. And the West is looking at is how can you still extract more efficiency to make yourself more productive, to make yourself more money, where the East is taking a look at is how does this relate to collectivism and how do we bridge human development? And that's the inherent risk. And that's where you start to see these differences with the framing of AGI, or artificial generalized intelligence. In the West, we're looking at AI 2027, you're looking at what's called the Terminator fallacy, right? In the East, they're viewing this as an existential threat of institutional power. And if you read the 15th five-year plan, China is putting themselves out as a leader in AI governance. Why? Because AI can disrupt institutional power and institutional truth. Whether or not we agree with their version of institutional truth, that's what the CCP relies on. And this is an existential
But fundamentally, though, our entire way of being, our moral code, our philosophy, our government structures, our capitalistic society is almost the opposite of China in every way.
Yeah.
So we're not going to change to the way China's doing it, regardless of which party's in power, or both. I don't see federal government, adopting a centralized one point of view. So how could we, I guess, take the very best things of what China's doing but do it in an American way?
Yes, and that's what I love, and that's what I believe in. And if you take a look at the development of political theory, in my opinion, we haven't had substantive development since the 60s and the McCarthyism scares and things like that, right? But I have this viewpoint, while we're losing right now, we have the ability to surpass and win because we are sitting on 400 or 500 years of human context and history. So the first step is to recognize that the state government's not going to save you. The federal government is not going to save you. It's going to start local. We are already seeing the retraction back to the community as a response to social media, as a response to geopolitical trends. So it starts there, and you say, okay, how can we use this technology to bridge us together? To be able to bridge those gaps, Jeff, requires common ground. So you and I might have politically opposite viewpoints. I might hate your political viewpoints, but 300 years ago, we had to set those aside and say, how can we build a school? How can we build a bridge to cross a ravine, right? So AI can then use that historical context within a community to bridge it together. Not solve it, but to say, these are the true problems, and here's our solutions, and how do you work together? And then what happens is you start to scale that to other communities and view it as a system. A good example of this is that we were working with a state government on energy policy, a large-scale infrastructure project, and before they started, they said, can you analyze other states' public records across projects like this? And I said, yeah. And it turns out we were able to mine over 5 million pages of documents, over 100 gigabytes of these boring regulatory hearings, and put a map out and say, this is what succeeded in this state. This is where it failed. This is it personalized to you so you can learn from others, right? And that's the viewpoint of collective individualism, where you don't lose your inherent belief system. I believe that democracy is the best form of government. I believe in the American vision. I am not an apologist for China, but I am someone who can look at China and say, we can learn a lot from them. And so
example then, Russ. Okay, so local community, they get more active. They start being more strategic about how they're going to adopt AI for planning their community. What does that look like? What things are they going to put in place over the next 3 to 5 years that changes their arc?
Yeah, so the first thing you have to recognize is that local governments are probably about 15 or 20 years behind any types of technological development, right? And that presents a massive opportunity. And so the way I think of it is in terms of 3 buckets. 1, compliance. How can you ensure that you are optimizing compliance outcomes in terms of revenue? How are you identifying unregistered Airbnbs? How can you streamline the land records process? Because at the end of the day, the vast majority of income will come from property taxes. That's their strongest revenue driver, and that's why they're running into some fiscal problem. problems. So the first is using AI not as a chatbot service, but to unify their own data to make better decisions for compliance. The second is in terms of decision support tools. My favorite tool that we built at Artifex, we call it the Oracle, is like SimCity, but in real life. You can simulate what happens if I put a school here in the community and the populations, right? And all of that was embedded within this public record that was historically inaccessible. So you have different scenario planning that impacts grants, that impacts financial models, that impacts policies. And you can essentially turn those unknown unknowns that Donald Rumsfeld talked about to known unknowns. So you're making a better decision process. And the last side is standard KPIs. As a C-suite member, you will want to have visibility into what's performing well, what's performing not. Right now, town managers don't have that. So it's all trapped in this unstructured data that needs to be unlocked. So I think you're going to see massive gains in terms of permitting. There are great companies out there doing that. In terms of constituent services, there are great companies going to do that. I think the linchpin in all of this is to recognize that AI is going to be the system that unifies all of these disparate siloed sets of information, gives it the proper context, and allows the civic worker to do their job better. In fact, most workers at the civic side, I think, are going to be immune from layoffs due to the AI. And this idea of China calls it purple collar worker. But that's where I think the adoption of AI is going to be seen at the local levels. How do you decentralize these types of, or centralize these siloed sets of data for better modeling in terms of compliance, decision support tools, and analytics?
Okay, so I mean, I'm a technologist and I'm also a marketer. So the technologist part of me gets everything that you just said. But I'm thinking to the families themselves, right? Like, and what's missing there is, okay, so then what's the messaging arc, the strategic framework for communicating with the households in the town? Like, okay, so here we're going to be using this information for this. Here's how your life's going to get better. Here's where we need your support. This is what we need you to vote for and why. The whole change management aspect, because you're seeing this massive pushback from Gen Z right now. Yes. Across the country on anything AI, not just data centers, but anything related to it. But the Pandora's box is already open. How do we bridge that gap from a communication standpoint and getting this next generation who will be tomorrow's homeowners, hopefully, right? How do we do that?
You democratize it and you first call it not AI. When we go to towns, we don't say we're an AI company, right? We use large language models to create structured analytics, right? That's the first step, right? Is to separate out government efficiency from Doge. Doge was the worst thing that could have ever happened in terms of the marketing around making governments more efficient. And I will go on and say, Elon, what you were trying to do was 100% needed, and I was a supporter of that, right? But the implementation was a nightmare, right? And in fact, inhibited other folks who wanted to do that. So the first step is you have to recognize that it's a vocabulary problem. Don't go and say you're implementing AI. You're implementing a decision support tool around urban planning that is used by your own data, that is transparent and always traceable. That's the first step, is you first find a problem that is a community's encountering that's been very hard, and then you use technology to solve that. And you always start small. And this is actually in a way where you get like a Palantir type model, where it's not a SaaS, but it's not a full consultancy, right? It's a flywheel, it's repeatable, because a lot of these communities have the same problem. So you go in and you say, for low costs, I'm going to solve your crisis around identifying short-term rentals, a really boring problem that most people would not consider very interesting, but is highly impactful for a coastal town that relies on housing, short-term rentals as revenue. Second is transparency. You have to be transparent. You have to say, this is the technology we're using, and you have to describe it in a way that empowers that community. Third, you have to understand the policies in which you're working on. And in fact, one of the very unique propositions of ArtifexAI is that some of our municipal and government clients have asked us to help write their policies. Why? Because we are not Anthropic and not OpenAI trying to soak up their data. We have data security policies, we have data privacy policies that we show them and say, hey, we are not going to be mining your data. We'll unify it, we're not going to resell that. We can white brand the models, we build the predictive models, but your data stays your own. That's the first step, is recognize, also telling them that your data is an asset that you have to be retained. And then you finally build that layer of trust, where then you start building out to other departments, where you start with working on a sewer problem or a housing problem or a short-term rental problem. And then you say, hey, did you know that this will also happen with the permitting? Did you know that this help could improve constituent services? And then you take that next bridge and figure out, working with the client, working with the government, to say, this is dual use technology. I can mine all of this public data and find every time Russ complained on public record about something, and that could have an adverse reaction. We're not in the business of doing that. So what we say is, hey, we have this mountain load of data. How can we anonymize this? How can we ensure that this is getting the right people without putting a target on people's backs, and really tackling this new dual use technology? And so that's how you get over it, which is transparency, education, and problem solving.
And that's 1, 2, 3, right?
I love 3 systems of 3. It's great. It's great.
It does. Well, no more than 7, right? So I think that's why our phone numbers are 7 digits long, because it was proven that we can't remember more than 7 things at once. So it's interesting how that works out. So along the way, how did you get connected to China? With the arc that you were on.
So my favorite thing is, apparently I can't do things for fun without it growing into to a project. And I was actually on a panel, and someone said, what was the funnest thing or the side project that you did with AI? And people on the panel were talking about, I made a food tracking app or something to track my pets with, or do something for my pets with. I raised my hand. I said I actually accidentally became an expert in China. And so it started by, I have a distrust of secondary information. I was not satisfied with the reporting coming out of the West on China. It felt thin. It felt biased. It didn't seem complete. So what I said was, what happens if I were to take my technology and point it to China and pull out these public records to better understand the context? And then you start to see the context in which their policies are being enacted, right? You have to remove yourself from the politicization, and you have to put yourself in an analyst perspective and say, what does the system look like? And then you start mapping these things together. And you start to see that there are interesting contexts in relation to their government, where if you were to start at the federal level, their federal government, you would be getting a lot of propaganda from the CCP. But if you start pulling back those layers, you start to see that they have public records laws. They want to improve their communities, much just like we want to. It's a different style. They do things differently. And inside there, you start to understand their policies and strategies. And so I started writing on this. Actually with the support of some folks in the American Society for AI, who kind of kicked me and said, yeah, you should start writing. And I started working on the chip race, partially coming out of a conversation I had with Chris Miller, who wrote The Chip War. And it bothered me as a technologist, where you have a historian writing on technology policy that says chips were the problem. The chips themselves are just silicon wafers. And so starting in the late 2010s, you start putting export controls on these things and saying, how can you stop China from competing? And this is not a Republican or Democratic issue. Trump started it a little bit. Biden really dug down on it. And then you've seen it going into the latest Trump administration. So I said, okay, as an analyst, let's test this hypothesis that I have, that I don't think the chip war is based on silicon wafers. And it's not efficacious, because you're not going to cut China out of the global economy. You're going to isolate them, and they're going to innovate. going back to the competition and innovative argument for earlier. So what I did was I started mining data from not only China, but also Malaysia and Indonesia and all around. And I said, what about the chip supply chain pipeline? We're slapping export controls on H200 NVIDIA chips. What about the chip packaging? And then I found out that there was a government document put out to US Commerce saying that's one of the biggest risks here in the United States is our chip packaging ability. The packaging is how you get the chips to talk to each other. China owns about 92% of the Asian market around that. While we were putting $5 billion to research how to do chip packaging, I was able to map out 3 new facilities for chip packaging in China and identify they have $3 billion in construction efforts. So now you say, okay, now they're thinking about this system. And this goes back into the argument of why China's kind of winning the race right now. They look at the
I think, but our whole view on this, not that we shouldn't recognize the threat of China as a worthy competitor, but the myopic viewpoint that how do we stop them from competing, which is ridiculous. You're basically saying we're not going to let a sovereign nation compete on its own merits to take care of its own citizens, regardless of whether we agree with their viewpoint or not, versus how do we be the best we can in this changing world entity. Because we're not going to stop them from doing shit.
That's what drove me. So I then took my technology and I said, okay, let's see what we could find and test this hypothesis. And what I found was that in 2016, AMD sold its chip packaging technology to Tongfu Technologies, which was backed by the big fund, which dealt with chip packaging. And then you say, oh, there's a system there. That's what led me to get published in the China brief to say, hey, there's intelligence that can be mined from these public records. And then you start to say, that's the system. One of the biggest gaps that they've seen right now in China is not around the chips. It's around the software layer. How do you get these chips to communicate with each other? CUDA is NVIDIA proprietary technology. They don't want to be beholden to that. Then you have the training of how you use, say, Huawei's Trilus architecture or these other modalities to say that they're training 50,000 Egyptian engineers on how to use this. NVIDIA's not training any. And then you start to see the system that laid out and you say, well, if you slap export controls on this, you're just limiting them from their high yield, high fidelity chips, which in fact is not what they're looking at anyways, because they use these swarm agents for other use cases. And so that's when I started to realize that the way of looking at policy, the way of looking at technology, policy and community development through technology can actually better improve human outcomes. And that's how I actually kind of went into the China side, where then I started reading about DAYU and their origin of government and saying, how do these policies interact with each other? How do you grow? And this has scalability to other countries around the world, whether you're talking about Saudi, whether you're talking about Iran, whether you're talking about Europe. There's a whole layer of human understanding that's been lost, but that's how I got into China, was just saying, hey, I have this technology that has shown efficacy in the United States. What happens if I were to try to understand it from another culture? And then you start having conversations, and especially with foreign attaches, where you can actually have substantive conversation. And they find that very interesting. And you can talk to them about their policies and not around the political language you have to use. And that's where meaningful conversations start to arise. And that's how you stumble upon being a China expert.
And here you are. So if we get this right, we get the local communities activated, we get all their data connected, we go out 10 years from now, what does a well-run community look like, and what does the potential standard of living look like for Americans within these communities?
I think it's improved. I think we're at a deciding point right now whether we want to go down a path of digital techno-feudalism run by Dario Amodei and Sam Altman, or where we retain these rights as communities. So I'm going to take the latter and say, what is my viewpoint? My viewpoint is that you have sovereign AI models that have trustworthiness in that local community, where they can understand the context of urban development that can improve human life outcomes, where you can understand that if you need housing, you can build housing that is of community characteristic and you don't have the NIMBY stopping you. You can understand that the resource war that you're running with your neighboring community, saying on poisoning their water supply with nitrates and phosphates, you can learn from them without being adversarial because you can understand the system you operate in. And then you start to scale that up and you can say, hey, if you look at the state of Massachusetts, we are having massive problems with Prop 2.5 override, where we've limited the amount of taxes that you could be raised on property assessments. Do we even know if those properties are being assessed correctly? And that has downstream effects on our community, right? And so I'm not espousing some sort of Star Trek utopia. I don't think we're there yet. But I'm also saying that what looks like success from a form of democratic governance is the understanding of not only the context around your community, but how it interacts with the other at all scales. And so what I see is that if you are trying to make an urban planning decision or an energy decision, because we are going to be in an energy and a water crisis like tomorrow. We're starting to see that now. How are you able to predict and create more resilient communities? That improves constituent services. That opens up new revenue streams. That opens up the ability to proactively prepare as opposed to retroactively try to fix, because they are sitting on the solution. So as you start to scale out, you have this idea of you are now democratizing Pandora's box, where the harms have now transformed into transparency. And this extends out to the political side. This extends out to the policy side. This extends out to the foreign policy side, where if you can imagine if in the future where you have an ambassador talking to another ambassador over a very, very tenuous situation, that the ambassador from your host country understands partially the context in which that their opposing counsel is arguing, so you can find common ground. That is the viewpoint where we, one, create a more resilient community. Two, we bring back local transparency and visibility and promote democracy, because I do not believe that local democracy is dead. I think it's stagnant. It has been defeated by Sinclair Media in the corporatization of civic function. And then you extend that out to better federal understanding and geopolitical understanding. But what's going to happen is that's not going to be run by government. It's going to be run by a public-private partnership. Sorry, 3 Ps.
Yeah, 3 times fast. Yeah.
much like how we built highways, or how like we have OPEC or the IAEA, right? That is my vision, right? Where we start to transcend what we view as democracy now as this bantering between two kind of disparate groups, to say, how do we bring the collective into that while retaining our democratic outcomes? And the only way you can do that right now, because of commerce, because of data privacy laws, those types of things, is to have that public-private partnership with an ethical company that puts human first.
Amen. Russ, man, this hour went by fast. So much to talk about, so little time. Thank you for all that you're doing, and thank you for being on Unscripted.
Thanks, Jeff. My pleasure, and I'm glad I got to be here and work with you.
Come back again soon.
I will.